Pinnacle Consulting, and he is one of the primary programmers of the SLAMM model, the sea level affecting marshes model. Any of you who've worked in the Gulf are no doubt familiar with it. So Jonathan and his team at Warren Pinnacle have recently completed a project that they did for us to look at a Gulf-wide application of the SLAMM model right from Brownsville across to southern Florida. And this is part of the broader effort that we've been working on with the other three LCCs across the Gulf on the Gulf Coast Vulnerability Assessment. And hopefully this will fill some, this project fills some key gaps in our knowledge of the potential impacts of sea level rise across the Gulf. Jonathan has been the primary programmer of the SLAMM model and since 1998, and he and his team have carried out over 100 applications of this model in the coastal U.S. Clients have included many of the partners of the LCC, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Gulf of Mexico Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Federation, and Ducks Unlimited. So I think we're ready to go. Jonathan's going to give a presentation, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. There's a couple ways you can ask a question. There's a chat feature that should show up on your screen, or you can use that, or we'll open the phone line at the end of Jonathan's presentation. And if you are on the phone, please make sure that you have it on mute during the presentation so we don't get any feedback. And with that,
finalize the proposal.
Oh, yeah.
Bill, unless you have anything else to add from Lafayette, I think we should turn it over to Jonathan.
I'm going to head over there.
Okay.
And we've
Hi,
got
it seems like somebody
their,
needs to put their speaker on mute.
Yeah, can everyone put their phone on mute, please?
So hi,
Right, Bill.
Thank you, Cynthia. As she said, I'm Jonathan Clow. I'm the president of Warren Pinnacle Consulting. We're a very small consulting firm out of central Vermont. This is a picture of the project team in slightly nicer weather, although we like the snow up here. With the notable and conspicuous absence of Dr. Jeff Eamon, who is with Image Matters, and he's a very important part of this team in terms of preparing model inputs, working on focal species analysis, and getting results available on WebGIS called SLAMM View. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about what SLAMM is, the sea level affecting marshes model. It is a model, though, that has been under development since the mid-1980s, developed by my close colleague, Dr. Richard Park, and also Jim Titus, EPA, were part of that original creation of the model. And the other thing that I want to point out is that the model integrates a number of different spatial data sets, spatial wetlands data maps, elevation data maps, tidal data, which is assigned spatially across the study areas. Any data about accretion or accretion models are integrated into the predictions. Any available data on erosion, as well as dikes, seawalls, and levees. All these are integrated simultaneously. So a little bit about the project's background was the request for a statement of interest that came out from the LCC, and this first bullet here is quite a mouthful, but this is the name of the RSOI, and so it is the evaluation of regional SLAMM results to establish a consistent framework of data and models to identify critical gaps for evaluating sea level rise impacts to coastal marshes across the Gulf Coast. That sounds like a sentence that we might write in one of our reports, and I'm start to try to split that into two. But there's a lot that's said there. Basically, what the request of statement of interest was looking for was a statistical analysis of the existing SLAMM runs prior to this project, and to assess the appropriateness of doing a mathematical extrapolation, a spatial extrapolation from the model domains to the non-model domains. So This slide here shows a little bit of the context of what we were talking about prior to this run. All these areas in the dark blue or dark purple color were the existing studies that were run. Some of them were run by our firm, and some of them were run by the Nature Conservancy under a US EPA contract. And I think one of the first things that we thought about when we saw the RSOI was that really if you take these dark purple areas, you can't consider them all to be comparable. It was not an apples-to-apples comparison, because in some cases, some of these simulations were, as they said, were run by different groups and had, in some cases, we had different sea level rise scenarios that were run. We had different cell sizes. We had different assumptions about what was going to happen, whether developed lands were going to be protected or not. And then, maybe most importantly, we had different assumptions about how accretion was modeled. Now, I do have to get into this one technical point about what marsh vertical accretion is. Basically, marshes and other wetlands will move vertically. They're not fixed in space. And there's a number of factors, both inorganic sediment capture and organic matter production cause the elevation to change, as well as some other factors such as shallow subsidence, deep subsidence, a number of factors that affect the elevation of those marshes relative to seawater. And for this reason, to model with a simple bathtub type model where you say, okay, this marsh is half a meter above mean tide level, and if we have a half meter of sea level, then that marsh is going to be down at mean tide level and subject to drowning. But that simple kind of model doesn't really give you a sense of what's going on with marshes, because over time the marshes themselves are moving vertically. So this is just to get even a little bit more technical here. This is an example of a feedback between marsh elevation movement and which we call the accretion rate, and the location of the marsh in the tidal frame. So if you look at this, the bottom axis here, you consider the maximum marsh elevation. Let's just say in this case this is around the high tide line. And the minimum marsh elevation, let's just say in this case this is around mean tide level. So as you have marshes that are much higher in the tidal frame, closer to high tide, they are going to be flooded less frequently. And therefore capture less organic sediment. But if sea level rise starts occurring and they start moving down towards mean tide level, well, they get flooded more frequently and more inorganic sediment is deposited there. And there's a second factor that occurs, which is a biological response to more increased flooding. The marshes themselves tend to put more of their energy into the shoots rather than into the roots. And so when you get down here, you have two factors that potentially lead to this kind of a feedback. And so for this reason, you might need to have a model to try to explain to you what might happen to the vertical movement of these marshes under sea level rise, because it could be that under your current circumstance, you haven't had a whole lot of sea level rise historically, unless you're in an area that's subject to a lot of rapid subsidence. And so you could have very low, all your data could suggest very low accretion rates. So if you say, okay, well, let's just project these data forward, you could be missing this important feedback. So for these reasons, and as well as the number of spatial data sets that are being integrated, it was our opinion that really trying to just do a spatial mathematical interpolation between existing study areas which aren't directly comparable themselves, as well as trying to take into account all the spatial data sets that you're looking at, just really wasn't going to be a possibility. And so we thought about it for a while and thought that what we would propose to do would be just rerun everything, including the areas in between. And for the existing study areas, we're basically going to keep those as is, with the exception of the fact that because all of these were high quality, the work that the Nature Conservancy did was very high quality work, but some of the assumptions are different. So we take some of the two assumptions that we really normalized across these data sets were how we were going to handle developed land, and at this point we're running sort of a worst case scenario. So assuming that the developed, I don't know if it's the worst case or best case scenario, depends on whether you're a marsh or whether you're a piece of developed dry land, but we're assuming that the developed dry land was not going to be protected by built-up seawalls and would therefore be subject to regular flooding. And then also, we took we decided to model with these accretion feedbacks. And some of the areas we had existing accretion feedbacks, especially in Galveston Bay and southeast Louisiana, on the basis of model calibration. In other areas, the model was either run prior to us doing that, or we just did not have the data or the scope that we needed to model those accretion feedbacks. So the overall project study area looks as follows. This is with all the SLAMM categories put into place. The red being dry land and the blue being water. The green, dark green being swamps, and some of these lighter colors being marshes, the light blue, the light orange, and the very light green. So the overall study area was over 40 million acres, modeled with and all new areas we modeled with a cell size of 15 meters, which is smaller than some of the sites which had been modeled at 30 meters, but and just slightly larger than the smallest cell size we modeled with previously, which was 10 meters, just in order to enable us to get all this done computationally in the time that we had. And as you can see, it's a lot of undeveloped land. Then you have swamps and developed lands. When you get here, these are your marsh categories here. Your regularly flooded marsh, which we call a high marsh, which is often a less saline marsh, and a regularly flooded marsh, which occurs lower in the tidal frame. So I'm just going to jump and look at some of the results just on a really bird's eye view type of view. So this the static sea level rise that we modeled was ranged from half of a meter up to 2 meters. So we modeled 1/2, 1 meter, 1.5 meter, 2 meters, and then we modeled an intermediate 1.2 meter scenario. Perhaps this sort of lies at the center of a lot of eustatic sea level rise, eustatic being global sea level rise. This sort of lies at the center of a lot of academic literature projections of what sea level rise might be, and you might consider that to be the most likely. So the dry land story is a little bit less dynamic and a little bit less interesting. Probably could primarily be told by a bathtub type model, but you can see that in terms, this is the percentage change by 2100. If you look at what you may consider the most likely, you're looking at an 8% loss of both types through the study area, up to as much as 15% losses. And what you might consider the 0.5 to be the most optimistic. The historic sea level rise would put you something around. If you look at the last 10 years or so, put you something around 0.3 or 0.4. And even in this case, you're looking at 3 to 5% of dry land loss. And the marsh results are a little bit different, a little bit more interesting. So for a regularly flooded marsh or a low marsh, these actually do better to start under low level sea level rise. And basically that's because there's a lot of high marsh in the study area that is subject to conversion, as well as some dry lands that could potentially get subject to conversion. So, but as you're, and also the regularly flooded marshes, at least according to the data that we had and according to the models that we used, have stronger accretion feedbacks. So they can actually move vertically. As they start to drown, they start to move vertically, and they do fine under moderate levels of sea level rise. They keep up. But as you get up to about 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100, you can see that this marsh type is breaking even. This 0 is the breaking even point, and starts to lose. Now the high marsh is a more sobering story in terms of this primarily looks at the existing high marsh because there are potentially some dry lands that could convert into a high marsh category. And we tend to convert a lot of those into our transitional salt marsh category, but there's some uncertainty whether it's going to be more of a scrub shrub or whether it's going to convert to a viable high marsh. It kind of depends on whether on the speed of sea level rise. So there's some uncertainty there. But in terms of the existing high marshes here, the blue line at the bottom, you can see that even under the lowest sea level rise scenario, over 60% is predicted to be lost, and then up to close to 100%. The inland fresh marsh, which is a non-tidal marsh, is much more similar to the drylands, and it has much more of a linear relationship. But it is also more susceptible than the drylands themselves. Apparently, a lot of these inland fresh marshes are more. There's more of those close to invulnerable elevations than the drylands are. The other piece of this analysis was a focal species analysis. And what this does is it links the species, several important species, with predicted habitat characteristics. And so the examples of the species that we put together metrics for are the seaside sparrow, which really requires either a high or a low marsh habitat. But a mottled duck, on the other hand, really requires these high marshes and the estuarine open water habitat. So based on the results we saw previously, we would suggest that this species is more at risk. And the black skimmer is really related to the fate of the beach. And I think that's a bit of a mixed story depending on the study area. Some areas the beaches are predicted to increase, and some areas they're predicted to decrease. And there is some uncertainty there as well in terms of which dry lands have a sandy substrate and are going to convert to beaches, and which ones are going to convert to marshes. So, so basically, a number of combining the entire study area together, a number of metrics were produced, including the mean patch size. So what's the mean size of these habitats, the number of patches, and the patch to area ratio, and these eventually will be correlated to populations of these species to get a sense of their overall fate. So the overall data products, there is a final project report which we are in the process of doing some revisions to, and that will be up the revised report will be up on the website within this month. And I think probably one of the most important data products here are the raster GIS layers for the entire project. There's a lot of maps that's coming out of here, and to a certain extent, if you're looking at, the results vary so much spatially, and when you're looking at 15-meter cell size across the entire Gulf, to just derive maps for the entire Gulf requires a pretty high dots per inch resolution in order to be useful. So we really think that the GIS products are almost more important than sort of printed maps of the entire Gulf. I just mentioned the focal species analysis. There is going to be a combination of tables and maps of those results. And then all of the types of results that you're looking at broken down by study area are made available in Excel. And then there's also a technical memorandum with the accretion approach, which is primarily included in the final project report, but there may be a few additional details for people that are particularly interested in accretion. And, now, all of these data sets are going to be available through a dedicated web page at warrenpinnacle.com. Because we're still undergoing our final project report, I am not going to give the URL right now, but this will be made available once, I think within this month, once we have finalized all these products. As well as, and this is a very important data product, is having everything up on the SLAMM View Web GIS, and that is at this point that's scheduled to go live in mid-February, and this basically will help get these maps available to everybody, even people that don't use GIS products. The other thing that I would like to point out is that a lot of people are shy away from GIS products because the S3 suite of products is so expensive. There is a wonderful open source free GIS called QGIS, which is actually the primary GIS that platform that we use. And so if anybody is interested in helping getting up on that, and we can send project files to them on that as well. So don't let price be your sticking point in terms of really getting into GIS stuff. So in terms of next steps and future analyses, this was a pretty big job to try to close all of these data gaps and to rerun everything that's existing. So it could really be seen as a solid base analysis on which there potentially future analyses could be done. One thing that we've talked about with our technical review team is the development assumption or the modeling of different development footprints. So our current simulations assume that the developed dry land is subject to flooding, but and in fact we even predict that marshes could potentially spread into the developed area, sort of the best case scenario for marsh migration, or just to see which areas are subject to flooding. There are two different ways that we also model developed land fate. One is to assume that all developed dry land will not accept marshes, but that will become flooded developed dry land. So just basically separate that out. And another way is to assume that that developed dry land will be protected, or to model future potential seawall development. And then we've also done modeling in terms of looking at different models of what is likely to be development footprints. In our practice, we've done a lot of uncertainty analysis recently, which is basically a Monte Carlo type analysis in which you take each of the each model parameter is subject to some uncertainty, like even tide ranges. Accretion rates are especially subject to uncertainty, even if you have a mechanistic model, that those model results are subject to uncertainty, and oftentimes there's not a huge amount of data to constrain what your assumptions are about accretion. So, and then elevation uncertainty, et cetera. All of these things can be varied, and you can have you basically produce hundreds of equally likely model outputs and then do statistical analysis of that. The thing that's interesting about an uncertainty analysis is that it actually, in some ways, can simplify the results, because it can take all of the sea level rise scenarios and all the model uncertainty and break it down into single maps, such as likelihood of habitat change or likelihood that a cell is going to be a coastal marsh. A lot of GIS analyses can be done, and we're hoping that a lot of people's teams will pick up these GIS layers and run with them. One possibility is like a change map from baseline to, say, 2050 or 2075 or 2100. There's also work that could be done with some of the existing study areas in cases if there were new wetlands data or if the original cell size was large. Here is an example of a follow-up GIS analysis in which we did in another location, where you're looking at marsh quarter identification. So what this map is showing is over some Google Earth satellite imagery. It's showing the locations of new marshes that are predicted in 2100 under a fairly likely sea level rise scenario. And so the light red areas here are the undeveloped dry land, and the dark red areas are developed dry land, and then you have some swamps and some inland fresh marshes. So what this can be potentially used for is to prioritize locations for in terms of marsh migration pathways. Just for policymakers. And that leads me to my final slide, which is just some other possible approaches in terms of planning, management, and adaptation strategies. Really, these data sets can be used to prioritize which areas may be subject to, should be restored, in which areas we can run analyses such as thin layer deposition to enhance accretion, or protection of marsh migration pathways. Just sort of an overall vulnerability analysis can be derived from these layers. For more information about this, about SLAMM in general, there is a SLAMM website. The model is open source and available. There's technical documentation and users manuals. A lot of information there. And then people can email me directly with questions, or Cynthia for updates on when these data products will be available. I think the whole suite of data, SLAMM View, the final amended report should be complete by the end of this month. And so that's the overview of this project. I think it's I think that it's a step forward, and I think that there's still work to be done in terms of understanding what it all means, mapping it all, and really interpreting all of these results. So that's my presentation, and I will open the floor to questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Jonathan. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, there's a couple ways to ask questions. You can just butt in on the phone, or there is a chat or raise hand function if you're on the webinar. So I'll just open it up. We've got a few minutes left. Any questions for Jonathan? As he mentioned, we do expect that this suite of final products will be done by the end of February. Those will be highlighted on the GCP website with the links to the other websites that Jonathan mentioned. Bill, any questions there in Lafayette?
No, I see quite a few nodding heads. I think it was a good presentation, Jonathan. It was informative for me because I've stayed out of some of the details the last several months, and it brought some things to light that made a lot of sense. So, thank you.
Thanks.
Cynthia, this is Kyle Balcom. Can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead, Kyle.
This may have been covered, but I was wondering, are all of the projections for 2100, or are there other milestones in there where the projections are relevant for?
Yes, I apologize. I was not clear on that. I think that my belief is that the dates that we're providing information for, they're definitely are intermediate dates, and I believe it's 2025, 2050, 2075, and 2100. Marco, is that correct? Put Marco on the spot. I don't think.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't. I think so. I have to check again, but definitely.
We've run a number of different projects recently, and they all have slightly different sort of rules in terms of what years they are being run for. So, let's see, model time steps. I'm just bringing it up right here.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's my recollection is that this one is 2025, 50, 75, and 2100.
Well, actually, yes. I think it's for some reason we have. I think 2055 and 2085 are also available. I think maybe through some guidance from our technical team in terms of what their expectations were. But so yeah, there are there are intermediate time steps, and I think those are very important because not a lot of people have 85-year planning horizons.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you. Excellent presentation. We look forward to the final product.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Any other questions for Jonathan at this time?
Yeah, this is Andy. I got a question. Just might be getting in the weeds a little bit here, but I'm wondering about how you can just say a little bit about how the model handles subsidence. You know, spatially, how variable is it, and just how spatially variable does the model account for subsidence? I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it really varies throughout the study area. I mean, there's some areas which are really demanding of a much finer spatial accounting of subsidence. And southeastern Louisiana really comes to mind primarily. And this actually, there's a paper, the work that is done here, there's a paper, it's on our website. Glick is the primary, Patty Glick is the primary author. And we went through a lot of different models of subsidence and projections of subsidence, and ended up using historical rates of subsidence that were, I believe it was Noah's work, and then work by Schinkel and Daka, and projecting those forward. So that actually, we ended up doing a Crying exercise, a spatial interpolation, and with a fairly small cell size. So it might have been, 50. The cell size for that project was 15 meters. So I think the differential subsidence was really dramatic. In Galveston Bay is another area where there's a lot of historical subsidence. However, working with some of the local stakeholders there, when we did that analysis, they suggested that due to the policy changes about water extraction, that we should not take the historical subsidence rates and project those into the future. And so we had a different subsidence. In other areas where subsidence is more spatially uniform, the way the model works is to look at the differential between the historic sea level rise, relative sea level rise, so the historic sea level rise in one location, and the global sea level rise, and assume that for the most part that differential is going to remain. Usually that's primarily due to land subsidence. And so in areas such as Florida, we modeled subsidence on a much more of a coarse basis, based on those differentials, the historical global trend and the historic local trend. And there's not a whole lot of subsidence that was predicted in Florida. A little bit, and then in Texas, there is some. The rates of relative sea level rise in Texas are a little bit higher so we are predicting some subsidence in those locations. So it really is variable across the study area.
Oh, thank you. Very nice.
Sure.
Great. Any other questions from anyone before we wrap up? Great. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for presenting today. And to those of you who are on the phone, this webinar was recorded and will be up on the website if there are others in your organization who you think will be interested in hearing it. And more to come by the end of the month in terms of final reports and the associated products. So thanks again for joining us, and hope to have you on the phone next month in March when we do our next webinar. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.